A young man who grew up on the streets receives an unexpected invitation to a luxurious party hosted by a tycoon, unaware of the true motive behind the gesture. Amidst high society, he realizes he was called there only to be humiliated, but his intelligence and wit turn the tables. As the night progresses, secrets begin to emerge, and he discovers there's a hidden connection between him and that world. When the truth finally comes to light, the party transforms into a battlefield where power, betrayal, and destiny collide irreversibly. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. Jack observed the gates of the Thompson mansion as if contemplating a distant world. The lights that began to turn on at the beginning of that Saturday night created an even more dramatic contrast between the white marble of the building and the darkening sky over New York City. Across the street, sitting on a bench worn by time, he adjusted the old backpack that carried his few belongings. The movement of luxury cars coming and going caught his attention. Gala dresses, impeccable suits, glittering jewels, everything seemed to come out of a movie he would never have access to. Jack, with his 23 years lived between the streets and shelters of the city, knew well the invisible boundaries that separated his world from that other one, so close geographically and so distant in possibilities. "Excuse me, sir," the deep voice of the security guard interrupted his thoughts. Jack instinctively stood up, already expecting to be sent away. "Mr. Jack Davis." Surprised to hear his name, he just nodded. The guard, a tall man with an imposing bearing, handed him a golden envelope. "This is a personal invitation from Mr. Richard Thompson for the birthday party that will take place tonight. He requests your presence." Jack took the envelope with trembling hands, almost dropping it. The paper was heavy, with embossed details that shimmered under the streetlight. His name was written in elegant calligraphy on the front. "There must be some mistake," he muttered, more to himself than to the guard. "There's no mistake, sir. Mr. Thompson was quite specific. The party starts at 8 p.m. You'll have free access." Before Jack could ask more questions, the guard had already turned and was walking back to the mansion gates. Stunned, he opened the envelope. The invitation confirmed. He was being invited to the 50th birthday party of Richard Thompson, one of the biggest names in the country's financial market. His legs automatically took him to Mrs. Johnson's small store, a lady who had always treated him kindly since he arrived in that neighborhood. The door chime jingled when he entered. "Jack, what a nice surprise, my boy." Mrs. Johnson smiled from behind the counter, but her smile faded when she saw the confused expression on the young man's face. "Did something happen?" He showed her the invitation, still unable to fully process the situation. Mrs. Johnson adjusted her glasses and examined the paper carefully. "My goodness, this is an invitation to Richard Thompson's party. How?" "I have no idea, Mrs. Johnson. A security guard crossed the street and handed it to me. Said Mr. Thompson himself requested my presence." The lady observed him for a few moments, thoughtful. "And are you going?" Jack ran his hand through his dark hair, a gesture he always made when he was nervous. "I don't have proper clothes. I don't know how to behave in these places. I don't know anyone." "We'll solve that." Mrs. Johnson was already coming out from behind the counter. "My Eric left some suits here when he moved abroad. You have more or less his build, and as for behaving, Jack, you're more educated and intelligent than many rich folks out there. You just need to believe in yourself." Before he could protest, Jack found himself being led to the back of the store where Mrs. Johnson kept some of her son's clothes. She rummaged through a closet and pulled out a navy blue suit. "Try this one, and don't come up with excuses. Opportunities like this don't come twice in a lifetime." As he looked at himself in the mirror, already dressed in the suit that miraculously fit him well, Jack felt a mixture of fear and curiosity. Why would a man like Richard Thompson invite him to his party? What could he expect from that night? "You look very elegant," Mrs. Johnson smiled, adjusting the tie she had picked out. "Now all you need is a good bath and a little courage." Jack observed his reflection once more. The young man he always saw in store windows from the outside. now seemed ready to enter a world that had always seemed unattainable to him. But a voice in his mind warned him, when something seems too good to be true, it's usually because something is wrong. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson," he said sincerely, moved by the lady's help. "I promise to take good care of the suit. Don't worry about that now. Focus on enjoying the night, and afterwards I want to know all the details." Leaving the store, Jack looked again at the mansion. The lights were now all on, and the music was starting to play. In a few hours he would cross those gates he had always observed from afar. What would he find on the other side? Why was he chosen? The questions multiplied in his mind as he walked to prepare for a night that, without knowing it yet, would change his life forever. The gates of the mansion opened punctually at 8 p.m. Jack, who had arrived a few minutes earlier, observed the line of imported cars forming at the entrance. Uniformed drivers opened doors for ladies in designer dresses and men in impeccable tuxedos. The contrast with his own arrival on foot couldn't be greater. Taking a deep breath, he approached the entrance. The same guard who had handed him the invitation was there, and with a discreet nod, allowed his passage. The first steps through the mansion's garden were surreal. The century-old trees were decorated with thousands of small lights, creating a path that led to the main entrance. "Your invitation, please?" An elegant receptionist approached him as soon as he reached the door. Jack handed over the golden envelope, trying to control the tremor in his hands. She checked his name on a list and, with a professional smile, indicated the way to the main hall. The environment was dazzling. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light, creating an ethereal glow over the guests. Huge floral arrangements decorated every corner, and waiters circulated with trays of champagne and canapes. The orchestra played soft music in the background, filling the air with violin notes. But it was the murmur that first caught his attention. As soon as he entered the hall, nearby conversations decreased in volume, being replaced by whispers and looks of bewilderment. Jack could feel the eyes of the guests following him, some with curiosity, others with evident contempt. "Who is that young man?" asked a lady, not bothering to lower her voice. "He doesn't seem familiar." "Must be some lost employee," her companion replied, laughing affectedly. Jack maintained his composure, remembering Mrs. Johnson's words. He took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and sought a more discreet place to observe the environment. That's when he noticed at the top of the main staircase the imposing figure of Richard Thompson. The host of the party was exactly as he appeared in business magazines: tall, perfectly aligned grey hair, a smile that conveyed authority. His eyes scanned the room until they found Jack, and his smile widened in a way that caused an involuntary shiver in the young man. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's voice echoed through the hall, amplified by a discreet microphone. "What a joy to see you all here tonight. Each of you represents an important part of my successful journey." The guests applauded, raising their glasses. Richard descended a few steps, his eyes still fixed on Jack. "Tonight is special, not only for marking my 50 years, but also for being an opportunity to reflect on origins and destinies, on choices and consequences." A young man near Jack moved, seeming uncomfortable. It was Nathan, Richard's son, known in the social columns for his extravagant parties and troubled relationships. Unlike the other guests, he didn't seem to be enjoying his father's speech. "I see here entrepreneurs, politicians, people who built their empires with determination," Richard continued. "But I also invited someone special, someone who represents a, let's say, different reality." The gazes turned to Jack again, who felt his face burn. Richard was about to say something more when he was interrupted by a woman who appeared at his side. It was Olivia Thompson, his wife, an elegant figure who rarely appeared at social events. "Richard, darling, I think the guests would prefer to start dinner," she said, her soft tone masking evident tension. The host seemed annoyed for a moment, but soon recovered his smile. "Of course, my dear, let's all go to the dining room. The night is just beginning." As the guests headed to the other wing of the mansion, Jack remained standing, processing what had just happened. It was clear that his presence there wasn't casual, but what was the real reason? "Don't mind my father," a voice beside him surprised him. It was Nathan Thompson, who had approached without him noticing. He has a special talent for turning any occasion into a spectacle of which only he knows the script. Jack studied the young heir's face, looking for signs of mockery or irony, but found only disconcerting sincerity. "Why did your father invite me?" he asked directly. Nathan shrugged, a gesture that contrasted with his refined appearance. "My father never does anything without a reason, but his reasons aren't always what they seem to be." Before they could continue the conversation, a waiter approached, informing them that dinner would be served. Jack followed the crowd towards the dining room, feeling that he was about to discover that the golden invitation was just the beginning of something much bigger than he could imagine. The dining room was a spectacle in itself. The main table, which easily accommodated 60 people, was decorated with arrangements of white orchids and crystals that reflected the light from the chandeliers. Jack was led to a strategically positioned place near Richard Thompson, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by the other guests. "So, young man," Richard began as soon as everyone was settled, "tell us a bit about your story. How does someone like you survive on the streets of New York?" The silence that followed was awkward. Several guests paused with their cutlery in the air, waiting for the answer. Jack took a sip of water, maintaining the calm that had always characterized him, even in the most difficult situations. "Your question is interesting, Mr. Thompson," he replied with a tranquility that surprised everyone. "But perhaps it's more relevant to discuss why you're so interested in my story. After all, it's not common for a man in your position to invite strangers to his birthday party." A murmur ran through the table. Olivia Thompson, seated to her husband's right, observed the scene with an enigmatic expression, her eyes now and then fixed on Jack with a disturbing intensity. "Well, what impertinence!" exclaimed a lady a few chairs down. "Richard, darling, is this some kind of social experiment?" "Actually," interrupted Nathan, who was sitting near Jack, "I think the young man raised a valid point. Why so much interest, Dad?" Richard maintained his calculated smile, but a muscle twitched in his face. "Curiosity, just that. I've always been interested in stories of overcoming." "Overcoming?" The voice that cut through the air came from Olivia. "Or would it be manipulation, Richard?" The atmosphere at the table became even tenser. Jack realized that much more was happening. Here than simple social provocation. Olivia stood up, her eyes now watery. "Excuse me," she said, "but I can no longer participate in this farce." Before she could leave, however, Richard held her by the arm. "Olivia, sit down. This is not the time." "And when will be the time?" "Richard, when you finish your little spectacle, when you've humiliated one more person." Jack observed the scene with growing attention. Olivia's reaction seemed disproportionate for someone who barely knew him. "Unless Mrs. Thompson," he called, his firm voice cutting through the tension. "You seem to know me from somewhere." The silence that followed was deafening. Olivia looked at Jack as if seeing him for the first time, really seeing him. Her hands trembled slightly when she sat back down. "Your eyes," she murmured, more to herself than to others. "They're exactly like his—" "Like whose?" asked Nathan now, completely involved in the situation. Richard hit the table hard, making the cutlery clink. "Enough, this is my birthday party, not a cheap melodrama." But it was too late. The guests' interest had transformed. It was no longer about the young man from the streets who had been invited to be humiliated. There was something bigger here, a buried story that was beginning to surface. "Jack," called an elderly lady sitting near him, "what's your full last name?" "Davis," he answered. "Jack Davis, but—" He hesitated for a moment. "That's the name they gave me at the shelter where I grew up. I never knew my real parents." Olivia let out a muffled sob. Richard remained rigid in his chair, his face a mask of contained fury. Nathan looked from his father to his mother, beginning to piece together a puzzle he never knew existed. 23 years ago, Olivia began to speak, her voice trembling. "There was a man who defied your father, Jack. A man who—" "Olivia!" Richard's voice thundered. Not another word. But something had changed in the environment. The power that Richard had always exerted over everyone seemed to be dissipating. The guests, who before laughed at his calculated cruelty, now looked at him with different eyes. "Please continue, Mrs. Thompson," Jack asked, his heart beating hard in his chest. "Please." The birthday dinner had transformed into something completely different. As the waiters served the dessert that no one would touch, a long-buried truth began to emerge, ready to forever change the lives of everyone present at that table. The tension in the dining room was palpable. Olivia Thompson, her hands still trembling, took her purse and pulled out an old newspaper clipping yellowed by time. Before Richard could stop her, she passed it to Jack. "This man," she pointed to a photo in the newspaper, "is Daniel Miller. 23 years ago, he was your father's partner, Nathan." She turned to her son, who was observing everything with a mixture of fascination and horror. "He was your father's best friend, actually, until he tried to destroy me," Richard interrupted, rising abruptly. "Olivia, you have no right to dig up this story." "No, Richard," she replied with surprising firmness. "It was you who dug up all of this when you decided to bring this young man here today. You knew, didn't you? From the beginning." Jack studied the newspaper photo carefully. The man in the image had his same eyes, the same face shape. The headline spoke of a financial scandal that had ruined Daniel Miller's reputation. "Daniel never tried to destroy you," Olivia continued, now addressing everyone present. "He discovered irregularities in the companies, tried to do the right thing, to report. And for that, he deserved to lose everything?" Nathan questioned, his voice laden with disappointment. "Is that why you destroyed his life, Dad?" Richard laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the hall. "You don't understand anything. Miller was a foolish idealist. He was going to ruin everything with his moral issues. I built this empire, everything we have." "At the cost of how many lives, Richard?" interrupted a voice from the door of the hall. Everyone turned. There, standing with a dignified posture despite his simple clothes, was Daniel Miller. His hair, once black like Jack's, was now completely grey, but his eyes were exactly like those of the young man sitting at the table. "How dare you show up here?" Richard vociferated. "I invited him," said Olivia, standing up. "When I saw Jack for the first time today, when I noticed the resemblance, I knew I had to do something." The guests watched the scene in absolute silence, like spectators of a play that surpassed any fiction. Jack remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the man who had just entered. "Martha," Daniel spoke softly, addressing an elderly lady who was sitting near Jack. "You remember that night, don't you? You were there." The lady, who had remained quiet until then, nodded slowly. "Yes, Daniel. I remember everything. Your pregnant wife, the despair when you lost everything, the baby born on that terrible night." "My son," Daniel completed, his teary eyes fixed on Jack. "The son they made me believe hadn't survived." Jack felt the world spin. The stories he had always heard at the shelter about having been found on a stormy night began to make terrible sense. Fragments of a long-hidden truth began to fit together. "This is ridiculous," exclaimed Richard. "You have no proof of any of this." "Actually," Olivia intervened, "I kept everything, Richard. Every document, every proof of what you did. Not just to Daniel, but to everyone who dared to stand in your way over the years." Nathan stood up, approaching Jack. "All these years I had a cousin I never knew existed? Someone who was deprived of his true family because of revenge?" The silence that followed was deafening. The guests, members of New York's highest society, were witnessing the collapse of one of the city's most powerful families. "You planned this, didn't you, Dad?" Nathan continued, his voice laden with bitterness, inviting Jack to the party, exposing him, humiliating him. "It was your way of making sure, of verifying if he was really Daniel's son." Richard remained silent, his empire of lies crumbling. Before his eyes, Olivia began to distribute some envelopes to certain guests. "Here's the evidence," she said. "Of everything. Every shady deal, every life you destroyed, Richard. I kept it for years, waiting for the right moment." Jack finally stood up, his legs shaky. His entire life, all the nights he spent on the streets, all the moments of loneliness and doubt, Everything was beginning to make sense in a painfully clear way. The dining room of the Thompson mansion, once the stage for so many lavish parties and million-dollar negotiations, was now witnessing the most important encounter of all those lives. Jack and Daniel remained a few meters apart, as if a sudden movement could break the reality that had just been revealed. "I looked for you," Daniel spoke, his voice choked with emotion. "For years, I searched every hospital, every record. They told me you hadn't made it, that your mother—" "Sarah," Olivia interrupted softly. "Her name was Sarah, Jack. Your mother was an extraordinary woman." The guests began to discreetly withdraw, feeling they were witnesses to a moment too intimate. Only those closest to the family remained, including Mrs. Martha, who seemed to carry the weight of 2 decades of secrets. "I was there that night," Mrs. Martha began to speak, her elderly hands trembling slightly. "Sarah was in the last months of pregnancy when everything fell apart. Richard had orchestrated everything perfectly, the false accusations, the forged documents, the blocking of all of Daniel's accounts." Nathan observed his father, who remained in a sepulchral silence. "How could— You, Dad? Daniel was your best friend." "Friend," Richard finally spoke, his voice laden with bitterness. "He was going to destroy everything we built. He thought we could simply expose the irregularities, do everything the right way. As if there was a right way in business. And for that you destroyed an entire family?" Olivia questioned, approaching Jack. "This young man grew up without knowing who he was, without the love of his parents, while you built your empire on lies." Jack, who had been observing everything in silence until then, took a step towards Daniel. His eyes, identical to his father's, studied every detail of that face he should have known so long ago. "What happened to my mother?" he asked, his voice barely containing the emotion. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if the memory was too painful. "Sarah was a literature teacher. We met at a book fair, can you imagine? She loved Garcia Marquez, said the magical reality of his books was more true than our own world." "That's why you always quote 100 Years of Solitude," Nathan interrupted, looking at Jack with a new understanding. "In the conversations we had today, you mentioned it several times." "It's my favorite book," Jack replied, surprised. "It always has been, ever since I learned to read at the shelter." "Sarah used to read to you," Daniel continued, his voice choked. "Every night during the pregnancy. She said you already recognized the story, that you moved more when she got to the most exciting parts." Olivia approached Richard, who remained isolated in his corner. "Aren't you going to say anything? Aren't you even going to try to redeem yourself?" "Redeem myself?" he laughed bitterly. "For what? For protecting my interests? For building something that will last for generations?" "Will last for generations," Nathan exploded. "Look around, Dad, your empire is crumbling right now. The only thing you built was a mountain of lies and destruction." At that moment, Jack did something that surprised everyone. He approached Richard Thompson and, with disconcerting calmness, said, "You know what's most ironic, Mr. Thompson? You invited me here today to humiliate me, to prove your superiority. But you ended up revealing your own fragility." Daniel approached his son, gently placing his hand on his shoulder. The gesture, so simple and yet so full of meaning, made both of them feel for the first time the weight of all the lost years. "Jack," Olivia called softly, "there's one last thing you need to see." She went to a small safe hidden behind a painting. "These are the documents that prove your true identity. Your birth certificate, the papers Richard altered. I kept everything, waiting for the right moment." Jack's hands trembled as he touched the box. Here was a piece of his history he had never known, words from a mother he never had the chance to meet. "Son," Daniel spoke, his voice laden with emotion, "I know I can't recover the lost years, but if you allow—" Before he could complete the sentence, Jack hugged him. The gesture, unexpected and deeply emotional, broke the last barriers. Father and son, separated by 2 decades of lies and manipulation, finally met. The dawn was already approaching when the last guests left the Thompson mansion. The luxurious hall, with its now wilted flower arrangements and half-empty glasses, seemed the perfect setting for the end of an era. Richard had retreated to his office, refusing to participate in any further discussion. Olivia led Jack, Daniel, and Nathan to the mansion's library, a more intimate and welcoming environment. The mahogany floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with books, and a fireplace provided comforting warmth to that night that had changed so many lives. "I think you should see this too," Olivia said, handing Jack an old photo album. "I kept it hidden all these years. They're photos of your parents, from when they were young and happy." Jack opened the album carefully, as if handling a precious treasure. The first photo showed Daniel and a dark-haired woman with a luminous smile sitting on a park bench. She held a book in her lap. "Your mother was 2 months pregnant in this photo," Daniel explained, his voice choked. "We had just found out you were coming. Sarah insisted on celebrating by buying more children's books, said you needed to have your own library from an early age." Nathan, who was observing the scene with a mixture of emotions, let out a sad smile. "Now I understand why you always carry books in your backpack, Jack. Even living on the streets, you always had a book with you." "It was my only luxury," Jack replied, gently turning the pages of the album. "Mrs. Johnson always kept the books people donated to her store for me. She said I had a writer's soul." Olivia stood up and went to one of the shelves, pulling out a specific book. "Sarah wrote poetry too. This notebook contains all her poems. She left it with me days before everything happened. As if she knew she would need someone to keep her words." The silence that followed was filled only by the crackling of the fireplace. Daniel approached his son, hesitant. "Jack, I know it's a lot to process in a single night. I know you've built your life, have your independence, but I want you to know that you can count on me for anything. I want to get to know you. Learn about all the years I missed." "I want to get to know you too," Jack replied, his voice firm despite the emotion. "I always imagined what my parents would be like, always dreamed of finding them, but the reality is much more intense than any dream." Nathan stood up, walking to the window. The mansion's garden was beginning to be illuminated by the first rays of sun. "We need to resolve practical issues too," he said, turning to the others. "Jack can't continue on the streets. We have more than enough space here in the mansion." "No," Jack gently interrupted him. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't stay here. Not after everything that's happened. Besides, I need to let Mrs. Johnson know. She must be worried." "Mrs. Johnson?" Daniel asked. "A lady who always took care of me," Jack explained, a soft smile on his lips. "It was she who lent me this suit, who always encouraged me to study, to read. She's the family I've known until today." Olivia discreetly wiped away a tear. "Then we should meet her too. She's part of your life, Jack, and now she'll be part of ours. I can arrange an apartment," Daniel suggested. "I have some savings set aside. It's not much, but it doesn't have to be now," Jack said, surprising everyone with his maturity. "We can take it slow, get to know each other, build this relationship. Little by little. After all, we have a lot of time to make up for." Nathan smiled, approaching his newly discovered cousin. "You're impressive, you know that? After everything you've been through, after all the revelations of tonight, you can still maintain serenity." "I learned on the streets that despair never helps," Jack replied. "Each day is a new chance to start over. And today is the first day of a new life for all of us." The morning light was now fully entering through the library windows, illuminating that unlikely group of people that fate had brought together. Olivia observed the scene with a mixture of relief and hope. After so many years of keeping secrets, she could finally see the truth coming to light. "Jack," she called softly, "there's one last thing you need to see." She went to a small safe hidden behind a painting. "These are the documents that prove your true identity. Your birth certificate?" The papers Richard altered. "I kept everything, waiting for the right moment." The days that followed Richard Thompson's birthday party were ones of profound transformation for all involved. Mrs. Johnson's small store became the unlikely meeting point between two worlds that until then had seemed incompatible. "I always knew there was something special about you, my boy," said Mrs. Johnson, serving coffee to Daniel in porcelain cups she kept for special occasions. "The way you spoke, how you carried yourself. It wasn't just education. It was something in the blood." Jack observed the scene with a discreet smile. Seeing Mrs. Johnson, the woman who had welcomed him so many times, talking with his biological father, was a surreal experience. Daniel listened attentively to every story she told about the years she had looked after Jack. "He was always obsessed with books," Mrs. Johnson continued, proud. "Sometimes I worried, you know. A street boy who preferred books to looking for food. But now I understand it was Sarah's voice reaching him, wasn't it?" Daniel wiped away a discreet tear. Sarah would have loved to know that. She always said that books were bridges between distant souls. The store door opened and Nathan entered carrying some bags. In the past few weeks, he had grown increasingly closer to his cousin, fascinated by discovering a family so different from the one he had known until then. "I brought something for you, Jack," he said, handing over a package. "I found it in the old stuff at home." Jack carefully opened the wrapper. It was an old copy of 100 Years of Solitude, with a dedication from Sarah to Daniel. His mother's delicate handwriting, preserved on the yellowed pages, made his heart tighten. "It was the first gift she gave me," Daniel explained. "Now it's yours." At that moment, Olivia entered the store. Her visits to this part of the city, once unthinkable, had become frequent. She carried a folder with documents. "Jack, we need to talk about something important," she said, sitting down. "It's about your future." "What do you mean?" he asked, noticing the seriousness in her voice. "Richard, he's trying to transfer part of his assets to overseas accounts. I think he plans to flee before the investigations begin. But I've managed to gather enough evidence to stop him." Nathan frowned. "My father still hasn't accepted that he's lost, has he?" "No," Olivia sighed. "But it's not about him that I want to talk. Jack, you're entitled to a significant part of the Miller fortune. Daniel was as rich as Richard before everything happened, and now, with the evidence we have—" Jack raised his hand, gently interrupting her. "Mrs. Thompson, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want any of that. Money was what destroyed so many lives, separated so many families." "But son," Daniel intervened, "you deserve compensation for everything you've been through." "What I deserve," Jack replied with a serene smile, "I already have now. A family, people who care about me, my true story. Money won't erase the past." Mrs. Johnson smiled proudly. "I always said this boy had a different kind of wisdom." "Still," Olivia insisted, "we need to secure your future. There's a spot at the university. I talked to some friends. You can study literature like your mother." Jack was silent for a moment, absorbing the proposal. The idea of following in Sarah's footsteps, of being able to study and dedicate himself to the books he loved so much, was tempting. "That," he said finally, "I accept, not for the money or the status, but because it would be a way to honor her memory." Nathan approached his cousin, putting his hand on his shoulder. "You're going to be an amazing writer, Jack. You have too many stories to tell." "And what about Richard?" Daniel asked, turning to Olivia. "He'll have to face the consequences of his actions," she replied firmly, "not for revenge but for justice, so that other families aren't destroyed like ours was." Mrs. Johnson stood up, going to a dusty shelf. "Before I forget, I saved something for you, Jack." She came back with a small box. "These are all your essays from your school days. I always knew someday someone would want to read them." Jack opened the box, finding dozens of carefully preserved sheets. His first stories, his first poems, all kept with care by this woman who had always believed in him. "See?" Nathan smiled. "You were always a Miller. You always had art running through your veins, even without knowing it." The small apartment in Greenwich Village, rented by Daniel for Jack, gradually came to life. The shelves, once empty, now housed, carefully organized, books, some new, others donated by Mrs. Johnson, and the most special ones inherited from his mother. On the main wall, a picture frame displayed a photo of a pregnant Sarah smiling amidst a pile of books. "Your mother would love to see this," commented Daniel, helping his son organize the last moving box. "You transforming an empty space into a private library." Jack smiled, running his fingers over the worn spine of his copy of 100 Years of Solitude. "Sometimes I wonder if she somehow guided me here. All the books I read, all the stories I wrote." The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Nathan, carrying a basket of treats prepared by Mrs. Johnson. "She said you need to eat well for your studies," he explained. placing the basket on the small kitchen table. And she also told me to say that she expects you for Sunday breakfast, as always. Jack's routine had changed drastically in the past few weeks. The mornings, once dedicated to the struggle for survival, were now filled with classes at the literature department. In the afternoon, he participated in a social project created in partnership with Nathan, a reading incentive program for children from underprivileged communities. How was the meeting with the publisher? Daniel asked, noticing an envelope on the table. They want to publish my book, Jack replied, still not fully believing it. They said my story has a unique strength. They want to launch it next semester. Nathan hugged his cousin, genuinely happy. That's incredible. It's going to be a success, I'm sure. Your words have the power to touch people, to make them see the world differently. Like your mother, Daniel added, emotional. Sarah had that same gift. She could transform pain into poetry, longing into hope. The sound of heels in the hallway announced Olivia's arrival. She entered the apartment carrying a folder and a worried expression. Jack, we need to talk, she said, sitting on the small sofa. It's about Richard. The name still caused visible discomfort in everyone. Richard Thompson, after the revelations at the party, had become increasingly isolated. His attempts to transfer money abroad were frustrated, and his reputation in the financial market was destroyed. He wants to see you, Olivia continued. He said he needs to talk to you before turning himself in to the authorities. A heavy silence filled the room. Jack exchanged glances with his father and his cousin, seeking some guidance. The decision is yours, son, Daniel said softly. No one will judge you if you don't want to see him. Jack walked to the window, observing the city he now saw from a completely different perspective. I'll meet him, he finally decided. Not for him, but for me. I need to close this chapter to really start my new life. Do you want me to go with you? Nathan offered. No, thank you. It's something I need to do alone. Olivia took a card from the folder. He's staying at this hotel. He said he'll wait for you tomorrow at 10 a.m. While Daniel and Nathan discussed the last details of the move, Jack took his notebook, a gift from Mrs. Johnson that had accompanied him for years. On the yellowed pages, he began to write. Dear Mom, today I understood that true power isn't in money or social status, but in the words we choose to use, in the stories we decide to tell. You planted in me, even without knowing, the love for literature that saved me so many times. Now, using that same love, I hope I can help others find their voice. Night was falling over New York, and the city lights began to shine. From his new home, Jack could see a piece of sky between the buildings, the same sky his mother observed when she wrote her poems, the same sky under which his father spent years looking for him. I think I've found my place in the world, he said softly, more to himself than to the others present. And it's exactly where I should be. The hotel where Richard Thompson was staying was quite different from the sumptuous mansion where Jack had met him. It was a discreet establishment in Midtown Manhattan, frequented mainly by business executives on trips. The doorman led him to the third floor, where a suite at the end of the corridor awaited. Jack adjusted the shirt he was wearing, a simple but well-pressed piece, a gift from Mrs. Johnson. His hands were slightly sweaty when he knocked on the door. A few seconds passed before Richard's voice, now stripped of its former arrogance, responded, "Come in, Jack, it's open." The man he found inside the room barely resembled the powerful tycoon from the birthday party. Richard Thompson seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. Sitting in an armchair by the window, he wore a simple robe and his hair, once impeccably combed, was disheveled. "Would you like some coffee?" Richard offered, gesturing to the side table where there was a thermos. "No, thank you," Jack replied, remaining standing. "You wanted to see me?" Richard sighed deeply, his eyes fixed on the urban landscape beyond the window. "You know, Jack, throughout my life, I believed that power was the only thing that mattered. Money, influence, control. It was like a game, and I always needed to be winning. And destroying other people's lives was just part of the game?" Jack asked, his voice calm but firm. "At first, yes," Richard admitted, turning to face him. "Your father, Daniel, was different. He had principles, values. I considered him naive, weak. But now I realize he had something I never had: peace of mind. Jack observed the man before him, trying to understand the transformation he saw. "Why did you invite me to the party? Why did you want to expose me like that?" "Because I knew," Richard replied, his voice trembling slightly. "I always knew who you were. I had people watching you for years, reporting your every move. When I found out that even living on the streets, you dedicated yourself to books, to literature, it was like seeing Sarah resurrected in you." "Did you know my mother well?" Richard stood up with difficulty, going to a briefcase on the bed. From it, he pulled out a yellowed envelope. "Sarah was more than my partner's wife. She was the conscience I tried to ignore. At social gatherings, business dinners, she always questioned our practices, always defended the underdogs." He handed the envelope to Jack. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated a few days before the events that separated the families. "Your mother wrote this to me," Richard explained. "It was a plea for me to change, to consider the impact of our actions on people's lives. I ignored her, of course, and when she threatened to expose some of our most questionable operations—" "You destroyed everything," Jack completed, beginning to read the letter. "Yes, but I didn't intend for her to—" Richard stopped, swallowing hard. The stress of the situation, the worry about the future, about you, it was too much for her. Jack held the letter tightly, his mother's words finally reaching him after so many years. "And yet you continued. Even knowing what you had caused, you continued destroying lives. Power is an addiction, Jack. The more you have, the more you want. But you know what my biggest mistake was? It wasn't destroying Daniel's life or indirectly causing Sarah's departure. It was losing my own humanity in the process." A heavy silence filled the room. Jack finished reading the letter, each word from his mother echoing in his mind. "Nathan is a good man," Richard continued. "Better than I ever was. He has his mother's heart, just as you have Sarah's heart." "What do you expect from me now?" Jack asked. "Forgiveness?" Richard shook his head. "No, Jack, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the whole truth before I turned myself in to the authorities, and I wanted to give you this." He pulled out a folder of documents from his briefcase. "These are the deeds to some properties that belong to your parents. I managed to keep them hidden all these years. Now they'll return to their rightful owner." "I don't want anything that comes from you," Jack said firmly. "It's not mine, it's yours by right, and more importantly, they were the places your mother loved. The beach house where she wrote, the country house where she dreamed of raising you. I'm not giving you anything, Jack, I'm just returning what was always yours." Jack held the folder, feeling the weight of so many memories he never lived. "Are you really going to turn yourself in?" "Yes, I've caused too much damage. Maybe by facing the consequences of my actions, I can find a bit of the peace your father always had." As Jack prepared to leave, Richard called him one last time. "Your mother was right, you know. In the last lines of that letter, she wrote that true power lies in the stories we choose to tell. Use your voice, Jack. Tell your story. Maybe that way other people can learn what took me a lifetime to understand." A year had passed since the night that forever changed everyone's lives. The auditorium at New York University was packed for the launch of Jack Miller's first book, Stories the Wind Tells. In the front row, familiar faces watched him with pride. Daniel, his father, now with a lighter smile on his face. Nathan, who had become more than a cousin, a true brother. Olivia, who had found peace in her own redemption. And Mrs. Johnson, who cried discreetly with happiness. "Literature isn't just about beautiful words on pages," Jack began his speech, his firm voice echoing through the auditorium. "It's about human connections, about the stories that make us who we are. Each person in this room carries a unique narrative, a set of experiences that deserves to be heard, understood, and respected." In the back rows, some young people from the social project that Jack and Nathan had created listened attentively. Words that transform had already reached dozens of communities, bringing mobile libraries and creative writing workshops to children and adolescents in vulnerable situations. My mother, Sarah, whom I never had the chance to meet in person, once wrote that words are bridges between distant souls, Jack continued, holding a copy of his book. Today I deeply understand the meaning of these words. It was through literature that I maintained my humanity on the streets. It was through stories that I found my way back home. Daniel lovingly held a small package in his lap, Sarah's poetry, a notebook which would be published next year. Her words, preserved for so long, would finally reach the world. It's never too late to start over, Jack went on. It's never too late to rewrite our own story. Richard Thompson, the man who tried to destroy my family, discovered this in the hardest way. Today, serving his sentence, he dedicates his time to teaching literature to other inmates. Transformation can come in the most unexpected ways. Nathan smiled, remembering the last visit he had made to his father in the penitentiary. Richard was different, not just in appearance, but in his essence. The arrogance had given way to genuine humility, and his letters to his son now overflowed with remorse and love. The money we recovered from the family's old businesses, Jack continued, was fully allocated to the creation of community libraries. The old Thompson mansion is now a cultural center where children from all social classes have access to books, art, and education. Olivia, who coordinated the cultural center, finally felt at peace with her past. Her decision to keep the evidence, to wait for the right moment to reveal the truth, had resulted in something greater than justice. It had generated transformation. But the greatest lesson I learned, Jack said, his voice choked with emotion, is that family isn't defined just by blood. Mrs. Johnson, who welcomed and loved me when I had nothing, is as much my family as my father Daniel. The bonds we build, the stories we share, are what truly define us. At the back of the auditorium, a young journalist smiled as she took notes. It was Emma, who had met Jack during an interview, and gradually became enchanted not only by his stories but by his way of seeing the world. The engagement ring on her finger shone discreetly. This book, Jack raised the volume, isn't just my story. It's a testimony that love, truth, and justice always find their way. It's a tribute to everyone who helped me get here. My father, who never gave up looking for me. Nathan, who showed me we can choose to be different from our ancestors. Olivia, who kept the truth until the right moment. Mrs. Johnson, who taught me that kindness is the greatest wealth that exists. Jack's last words were received with an emotional round of applause. As the auditorium rose in a standing ovation, Daniel approached his son, handing him the package he had been holding. It was the old copy of 100 Years of Solitude that Sarah had given him, now passed from father to son. Your mother would be very proud, Daniel whispered, hugging Jack. Outside the auditorium, New York City continued its frenetic pace. But inside that space, a group of people celebrated not just the launch of a book, but the victory of love over hate, of truth over lies, of justice over greed. And on the pages of Jack's book, the first dedication read, "To Sarah, my mother, who taught me to love words even before I was born. To Daniel, my father, who never lost hope. And to all those who believe in the transformative power of stories."